My name is Meredith McLean. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a marketing strategist. In the quiet, practical way I approach my life, I'm quietly proud of what I've built for myself, especially considering I never finished college. Dropping out 5 years ago wasn't the glamorous, rebellious choice people sometimes imagine. For me, it was a complex cocktail of doubt, financial strain, and the exhaustion of trying to fit into a mold that didn't feel like me. Yet, here I am, a decade plus in the field, carving out a solid career in brand development for tech startups, a niche where strategic thinking and resilience matter more than a degree. When I look at my life now, it's a balance of comfort and contentment, not the loud success stories you see on social media. I live in a modest but cozy apartment in the city with my husband, Mark Simmons. Mark is my anchor, steady, supportive, and always gently reminding me that my worth isn't tied to anyone else's approval, especially not my family's. Our home is filled with little routines: Sunday morning coffee rituals, late-night brainstorming sessions about Mark's tech projects, and the quiet hum of everyday life that makes me feel secure. Despite all this, my connection with my family is strained, to say the least. I'm not sure when the gulf between us widened so deeply. I do know it started after I dropped out, but the coldness has lingered, maybe even thickened over the years. I try to reach out, sending texts, making calls, even showing up for holidays when invited. But those efforts often feel like throwing pebbles against a brick wall. My father, Richard, barely acknowledges me, and my younger sister Olivia's smiles feel forced, like she's playing a part in a family drama where I'm cast as the villain. The latest reminder of this tension came just yesterday. My phone buzzed with a call from my mother, Susan. I hesitated before answering, part of me hoping for a genuine connection, another part bracing for the usual polite dismissal or veiled criticism. But before I could even say hello, the call ended. No voicemail, no message, just silence echoing louder than any words. It stung more than I expected. I remember once sitting at the kitchen table, back when things felt less fractured, watching Olivia unwrap her graduation invitations with our mother beaming beside her. I smiled, trying to join in the excitement, but the look on my father's face told me I was invisible, like I was a shadow at the edge of a bright room. That night, I tucked away those feelings in a quiet corner of my heart, telling myself that family could be complicated, that maybe things would change. But now, standing here in my own space, I realize those wounds didn't just disappear. They've shaped the way I see myself, the way I guard my heart. I've learned to keep my pride quiet, to build a life on my own terms, rather than wait for their acceptance. And I think that's why, even though my family cut ties so coldly, I haven't completely let go. There's a thread of hope, stubborn and fragile, woven through years of hurt and silence. This is where I am, a woman who's been called an ugly college dropout by the very people who should have been her biggest supporters. It's a label that's stuck, not just in their minds, but in the spaces between us. But beneath that label is a person who's learning to stand tall, quietly, with or without their approval. And as much as I try to keep my distance, part of me still wonders if one day they'll see me differently, or if I'll have to show them who I really am before they do. 5 years ago, when I made the gut-wrenching decision to leave college, I thought it might be the hardest choice I'd ever have to face. I never imagined it would be the moment everything shifted in my family, the turning point where their affection and respect for me quietly unraveled, replaced by a cold, unspoken judgment. The pattern started subtly at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew, taking root in every interaction, every gathering. Olivia, my younger sister, suddenly became the golden child, the perfect daughter, the one who made all the right choices, the one they celebrated and lifted up. And me? I became the ugly dropout, the family disappointment, the unspoken shame that seemed to haunt every corner of our home. It wasn't just the words, though those stung enough. It was the way the tone of voice changed when my name came up, the way my presence at family events felt less like a welcome and more like an uncomfortable obligation. I remember one Christmas dinner, the year after I left school, sitting across the table from my father, Richard. His eyes barely met mine as he raised his glass in a toast to Olivia's clean path through college and into a promising career. The words were congratulatory, sure, but the subtext was brutal. It was a reminder that I didn't belong in that narrative anymore. I was the detour, the mistake that everyone was doing their best to forget. Until then, I had tried to excuse it, telling myself they just didn't understand what I was going through, or that they were scared for Olivia and wanted her to succeed without distractions. I convinced myself that my mother, Susan, was trying to keep peace, that her softly spoken reassurances were genuine attempts to bridge the gap. But even Susan, who once was my ally, seemed to withdraw into her role as mediator, never truly standing up for me when the barbs from my father and sister flew so freely. Olivia's role in all this was complicated. She wasn't cruel out of malice so much as insecurity. She wanted the family's approval desperately, and part of that meant playing her role flawlessly. I remember one dinner party when Olivia leaned toward me just enough that no one else could hear and whispered, "You could have been like me if you'd just kept trying." The sting of those words was made worse by the fact that she seemed genuinely convinced she was being kind, trying to push me toward some version of success I no longer believed in. That party was a turning point. Richard was loud and clear that night. Olivia's future is bright because she's responsible. Meredith? Well, sometimes you have to know when to cut your losses. The family laughed nervously, but I felt the weight of those words crushing me in the middle of the room. Susan quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. I realized that the family first mantra they often paraded was a one-way street, one that didn't include me. In the months that followed, holidays became minefields. Invitations were sometimes forgotten or sent last minute, and I learned to expect half-hearted hugs from people who once embraced me with warmth. The family dinner table, once a place of shared stories and laughter, had become an arena where I was invisible or the target of thinly veiled criticism. I would sit quietly, nursing a drink, feeling the silence grow heavier with every passing minute. I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone sometimes, the ones where Olivia and I smiled side by side before this shift. I longed for that closeness, but knew deep down it was slipping further away. I clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was a phase, that family dynamics could heal, that time might soften their judgment, or at least open a door to honest conversation. But with every passing year, that hope felt more fragile, the walls between us more impenetrable. Even as the family's coldness settled in, I tried to hold my head high. I reminded myself that their opinions didn't define me, that their love was conditional and flawed, but the core of who I was remained intact. Yet the ache of rejection was real and raw. I learned to wear my resilience like armor, but beneath it was a quiet yearning for acceptance, a wish that my family could see beyond the label of dropout, recognize the woman who persisted, who fought her own battles in silence. Looking back, I realized that the roots of this dysfunction weren't just about my leaving college. It was about control, expectations, and a family's desperate need to maintain an image of perfection. Olivia's achievements were paraded as trophies, a shield against anything that threatened their pride. And I, with my unconventional path, was cast as the inconvenient truth. In their eyes, I was a problem to be marginalized or erased, not a sister or daughter to be loved unconditionally. This harsh reality shaped the way I navigated every family interaction since. It set the stage for every cold shoulder, every whispered insult, every exclusion that followed. And while I've learned to protect myself, there's a part of me that still wonders, what if they could see me for who I really am, not just the role I was forced to play? What if the ugly dropout label could be lifted, replaced by something stronger, something undeniable? Those questions linger quietly beneath the surface, stirring a determination I didn't know I had. Despite the icy distance and unspoken judgments from my family, I found myself stepping into roles that no one else seemed willing or able to fill. It was as if my sense of responsibility outweighed their coldness, even when it cost me dearly. I became the unseen pillar holding up parts of the family structure that everyone took for granted. When my parents struggled with bills, I quietly transferred funds from my own account to cover their mortgage payments, knowing full well my sacrifices would go unnoticed. Or, worse, unappreciated. I remember one particular winter when my father's health took a downturn. The doctor's office called about medication refills and specialist appointments, and without a second thought, I rearranged my schedule to drive my father to his appointments. The cold hospital waiting rooms, the sterile scent of antiseptic, the hushed beeping of machines, all of it became background noise to the effort of keeping my family afloat. Mark watched me through those weeks with a mixture of admiration and concern. He'd see the exhaustion creep into my eyes, the way I carried the weight silently, like a secret burden. There were times I stayed up late, poring over their medical bills and insurance paperwork, trying to decode the confusing jargon to prevent any missed payments. I'd cross-reference dates, call providers, and make sure everything was handled before the next deadline. This wasn't just financial support. It was emotional labor, a constant vigilance against crises that no one else seemed motivated to manage. Yet, when I brought up these efforts, the reaction was usually a dismissive shrug or a pointed reminder of my failures, as if caring for them was some kind of obligation I'd failed at. Supporting Olivia was even more complicated. Despite her role as the family golden child, she was burdened with pressures I understood all too well: the need to perform, to please, to embody the family's ideal. I tried to be there for her in small ways, proofreading her college essays late into the night, helping her navigate scholarship applications, and even sitting with her through moments of stress when grades or social expectations felt overwhelming. My involvement was always quiet, never advertised, because I knew how the family narrative worked. I was the dropout, the one who couldn't be trusted to celebrate or share in their successes without judgment. One evening, I recall sitting in the living room of my apartment, laptop open, soft jazz playing in the background, while Olivia called me, voice trembling from the pressure of finals. She admitted, quietly, that she wished things between us weren't so strained. For a moment, the walls came down, and I saw her vulnerability beneath the perfection, but the phone call ended with her hesitant words. "I just wish Dad saw you like I do," followed by a silence that spoke volumes about the gulf still between us. Mark, my husband, was my quiet confidant through all this. He witnessed the toll of balancing my family's needs with their rejection, the way my shoulders tensed with every call or message left on read. He never pressured me to fix things or explain away their attitudes. Instead, he offered steady support, reminding me that my worth was inherent, not defined by the McLean's approval. "You give so much," he'd say softly, "but don't forget to save some of that love for yourself." His words were a balm, even if I struggled to fully accept them. I sacrificed opportunities too. When a promotion required relocating to a different city, I declined, choosing proximity to my family over career advancement. It was a decision made from loyalty and hope, that being nearby might bridge the growing divide, that physical closeness could translate into emotional closeness. But instead, I found myself caught in an invisible tug-of-war, always present, but never truly welcomed. Looking back, those years felt like walking a tightrope, balancing financial support, emotional caregiving, and my own aspirations against the backdrop of cold shoulders and whispered judgments. It was exhausting, but I convinced myself that this was the price of family. Even as the sacrifices piled up, I clung stubbornly to the idea that perseverance and loyalty might eventually mend what had broken. But beneath the surface, I was fraying. The weight of giving without receiving, of caring without acknowledgement, chipped away at my spirit. I learned to mask the hurt with quiet determination, to smile through the loneliness. Yet, in the quiet moments alone, I questioned how much longer I could hold on to a family that seemed to want to erase me. That tension, the clash between my efforts to support and their refusal to accept me, is what defined those years. It was a silent battlefield where love, obligation, and rejection collided. And even as I poured myself into keeping the family afloat, the label of ugly college dropout hung over me like a shadow, dimming the light of all I gave. Still, I hoped. I hoped that my sacrifices mattered, that one day, my family might see beyond their disappointment and recognize me not as a failure, but as someone who stood by them when it mattered most. But that hope was fragile, always on the edge of breaking, as the coldness in their eyes reminded me that sometimes love isn't enough to heal the wounds left by judgment and exclusion. That night, the night of Olivia's college acceptance party, was a sharp, painful reminder of how far I'd fallen in my family's eyes. I arrived early, dressed in a simple but elegant navy dress, my heart a mixture of hope and dread. The house was buzzing with the kind of excitement only an achievement like this could bring. Balloons in the school colors, congratulatory banners, and a spread of appetizers filled the room. Friends and family milled about, laughter and chatter creating a warm, celebratory atmosphere. But for me, it felt cold and isolating. From the moment I stepped through the door, I was met with polite nods and distant smiles. Olivia, radiant with her typical perfection, was surrounded by admirers, teachers, family friends, classmates. Everyone's attention was on her, as it should have been on this important milestone. But for me, I was a shadow in the background. I tried to engage in small talk with a few guests, but the conversations were shallow and quickly ended, as if I were invisible. I caught my father's eyes across the room just as he raised his glass for a toast. His gaze didn't meet mine. It skimmed past, lingering on Olivia's beaming face. Then he spoke, his voice loud and clear. To Olivia, on her clean path, a shining example of hard work and dedication. May her future be as bright and unblemished as her record. The words were meant as praise, yet they cut me deeply. The phrase clean path wasn't just about Olivia's accomplishments. It was a pointed contrast to me, an unspoken indictment of my own so-called failures. I felt my throat tighten and my hands grow clammy. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for me to respond or spill the truth about my struggles. But I didn't. Instead, I forced a smile, raised my glass in return, and tried to swallow the lump forming in my chest. Then Olivia came closer, her voice barely above a whisper, but full of icy satisfaction. You could have been like me if you'd just kept trying, you know. Her words stabbed deeper than any public insult. What made it worse was the fact that she said them in front of family friends, people who had once admired me or at least treated me with respect. I saw their eyes flicker awkwardly between us, uncertain about how to react. No one spoke up. My mother, Susan, was standing nearby, and I looked to her for some semblance of support or at least acknowledgement. But she brushed past my gaze, shifting the conversation toward the catering and away from the tension. Let's not dwell on the past tonight, she said softly, her voice laced with dismissiveness. It was clear she wanted to keep the peace, but in doing so, she silenced me, reinforcing the message that my pain was inconvenient. The room seemed to contract around me, the air thick with unspoken judgments. I felt like a ghost haunting a celebration that wasn't meant for me. My heart pounded as I caught snippets of side conversations, comments about Olivia's bright future, her scholarships, her flawless grades, while no one mentioned me at all. I tried to remind myself that this was Olivia's night, that I should be happy for her. I even thought maybe I was overreacting, reading too much into their behavior, but the sting of my father's toast and my sister's whispered cruelty left no room for denial. Later, when a few guests had drifted away and the party was winding down, I found a quiet corner to gather my composure. The familiar ache settled in my chest, a mix of sadness, anger, and humiliation. Mark's hand on my shoulder, steady and reassuring, reminded me that I wasn't alone, but even his presence couldn't erase the feeling that I had been erased from this family moment. That night marked a turning point. The public snub wasn't just a one-time slight. It was the crystallization of years of cold indifference and veiled contempt. It was the moment I realized that their pride in Olivia was inseparable from their dismissal of me. I understood that no matter how much I sacrificed or endured, I was not part of the story they wanted to tell. As I left the party, the echo of their words and silences trailed behind me like a shadow. I tucked those feelings deep inside, burying the hurt even as it fueled a growing resolve. The label of ugly college dropout was no longer just whispered behind my back. It was broadcast in the loudest way possible, in front of everyone I cared about. And in that moment, I knew the family I thought I belonged to was no longer the home I could rely on. The shock came quietly, in a moment I wasn't prepared for. It was one of those little instances where the truth slips in through the back door, unannounced and far from the drama I expected. My mother, Susan, was visiting Mark and me one afternoon, casually sipping tea in our modest living room. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, dust motes dancing lazily in the air. I had been working on a project proposal at my desk nearby, the soft clicking of my keyboard mingling with the low hum of the city outside. Mark was in the kitchen, making coffee, when my mother decided to drop the bombshell. "By the way," she said, her voice as light and breezy as if she were commenting on the weather, "the family had a meeting last week. They've finalized the will and the distribution of the business shares. You're not included." I froze, my fingers hovering over the keys, the words sinking in with a cold weight that spread through my chest. Not included. No warning, no conversation, no chance to explain or defend myself. Just excluded, as if I had been erased from the family ledger. Mark paused mid-pour, his brow furrowing as he processed the news. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain composure, but inside, a storm was raging. What? I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Susan shrugged, as if it was some mundane bureaucratic detail. "It was a private meeting. Your father and Olivia insisted on it. I wasn't even allowed to speak up. They said it was best this way." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to ask why, but the silence in the room felt suffocating. The casual cruelty of it, the way my mother could say this as if it were no big deal, stung far worse than an outright confrontation. I could see Mark's protective instincts kicking in. He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "Meredith, this isn't right. You've done so much for them. You deserve better." I nodded, tears threatening to spill, but I swallowed them back. Years of trying to hold it together, to find some shred of belonging, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. They didn't just reject me emotionally. They had chosen to cut me out legally and financially. My sacrifices, my support, they meant nothing. Worse, they had made this decision behind my back, excluding me from the very conversation that sealed my fate. The most painful part was knowing that Olivia had kept this from me. When Mark mentioned it during a recent call to my sister, Olivia's voice had faltered, and she deflected, insisting everything was fine. It was a lie, a deliberate omission, proof that she was complicit in the final blow. I thought back to all those times I had put my trust in them, helping with bills, driving my father to appointments, supporting Olivia's college dreams. Every gesture had been met with coldness, yet I had hoped for recognition, for at least a conversation about their plans. Instead, they had met behind closed doors to decide my exclusion. That night, I sat in our quiet living room long after my mother left, the room heavy with silence. Mark stayed beside me, his steady presence grounding me. I finally let the tears fall, quiet, bitter, and raw. It was grief for the family I thought I had, and the cruel reality I was facing. But beneath the sorrow, something else began to stir, a hardening resolve. The betrayal cut deep, but it also illuminated a harsh truth I'd been avoiding. This family, this system I'd tried to support and be part of, had no place for me. Not truly. Their idea of family was conditional, transactional, and cruel. I promised myself then that I wouldn't be their victim anymore. I wouldn't let this exclusion define me or dictate my worth. If they wanted to erase me, I would become someone they couldn't ignore, someone who controlled her own destiny. But I would do it on my terms, not by their rules. Mark watched me with quiet pride as I wiped my tears and straightened my shoulders, a silent vow passing between us. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I needed to protect myself from the family that had chosen to abandon me, and that meant building walls and setting boundaries that could not be crossed. The wound was fresh, but in its rawness lay the spark of transformation. I wasn't just going to disappear quietly into the background of their perfect family story. I had a story to tell, and they would have to listen. The question was when and how. For weeks after that afternoon with my mother, I found myself caught in a spiral of reflection, deep, raw, and unrelenting. The initial shock of being cut off completely from the family's financial and emotional circle, had given way to a slow-burning fire of anger. It was a fury built on years of hidden wounds and unspoken betrayals, and it demanded to be acknowledged. I remember sitting alone in our living room one evening, the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the curtains, and feeling the weight of everything crash down on me all at once. I ran through so many memories, each one a small fracture in the image I'd held onto so tightly for years. The countless times I had given without receiving, money for bills, rides to doctor appointments, help with college applications for Olivia, all met with a coldness that felt like a deliberate erasure of my existence. I thought about the holidays when I was the last to be invited, when my presence was tolerated but never celebrated. I recalled the sting of my father's toast at Olivia's acceptance party, the whispered jabs from my sister, and my mother's evasive silences that felt like quiet consent to their cruelty. Each memory was a thread unraveling the fragile hope I'd clung to. It wasn't just the exclusion or the rejection, it was the pattern. How every time I stepped up, every sacrifice I made, was met with little more than dismissal, or worse, quiet resentment. I realized the family didn't just overlook me. They weaponized my loyalty against me, using it as proof of my supposed failures. They demanded I stay close, support them, fix problems that weren't mine to fix, and then punished me for not fitting the mold they wanted. The realization hit me like a storm. They would never change, not because they were incapable, but because their love was conditional, tied to a narrative I could never live up to. The family first mantra was a hollow echo, a phrase used to mask favoritism and control. I had been their emotional and financial safety net, but they never spared a thought for my feelings or my dignity. And when I finally needed them, there was only silence. As anger flooded through me, it shifted into a fierce kind of clarity. I wasn't going to keep pretending that their approval mattered more than my own self-respect. The years of trying to fit into their narrow, unforgiving expectations had not only failed, they had nearly broken me. But now, that brokenness felt like something I could rebuild from, not a prison to stay trapped in. I found myself speaking the words aloud in the quiet of our home. I owe them nothing. It was both a shield and a declaration. I didn't have to carry their judgments or bear their rejection anymore. The boundaries I'd blurred out of loyalty had been trampled, and it was time to draw lines that protected me. Mark noticed the change. Where before I carried my exhaustion and sadness like a cloak, now there was a steadiness in my voice, a resolve that hadn't been there. One night, as we sat on the couch after dinner, he reached out and took my hand. "You're stronger than you know," he said softly. "This isn't just about them. It's about you, finally taking care of yourself." Those weeks became a turning point. I started documenting every interaction, not out of bitterness, but as a way to understand the patterns and prepare for what might come next. Every dismissive comment, every financial transaction, every cold phone call found its way into my journal. It was a methodical act of reclaiming control, replacing chaos with order. The anger also fueled a strategic mindset I hadn't allowed myself before. Instead of reacting with pain, I began to think about how to protect what was mine, my career, my assets, my emotional well-being. I realized that the family's reliance on me was a vulnerability they didn't recognize, and I could no longer afford to be their safety net without safeguards. And yet, amid the growing fire of anger and resolve, there was a quieter current beneath, a flicker of sadness for what had been lost and what might never be restored. I grieved not just the rejection, but the sisterly bond I once hoped for, the family dinners filled with laughter, the shared memories before everything fractured. It was a mournful recognition that some wounds don't heal with time or good intentions. But this grief was no longer a weight to carry. It was part of the foundation I would build upon. I was no longer willing to be the invisible one, the scapegoat, the ugly dropout. I was ready to step into a new chapter where my worth wasn't dictated by others, especially not by those who had shown me their true colors only after I stumbled. In those long, quiet nights of reflection, I made a promise to myself. I would rewrite my story, not with their approval, not on their terms, but on mine. The family that had labeled me and discarded me would soon learn that I was far more than the sum of their misunderstandings and cruelty. They might never change, but I would. And I would do it with quiet strength and unwavering purpose. In the weeks following that crushing revelation, my mind became a relentless engine, turning over every detail of my fractured family relationships. I knew I couldn't simply walk away without understanding the full landscape, the web of dependencies, the silent debts, the unacknowledged roles I'd played. So, I began a meticulous inventory of everything I'd given, everything they'd taken for granted, and the power dynamics that still tethered me to them. Sitting at the kitchen table one evening, the hum of the city outside my window fading into the background, I spread out a stack of papers, bank statements, old check registers, copies of bills I'd paid over the years. Each document was a stark reminder of how deeply intertwined my life had been with theirs, even as they distanced themselves emotionally. I'd quietly kept the family mortgage afloat when my parents hit rough patches, slipping transfers from my account without fanfare or expectation of thanks. Medical bills for my father's health scares, car repairs for my mother's aging vehicle, even small, unspoken expenses like school supplies and tutoring for Olivia, all quietly covered by me. But it wasn't just the money. I traced back the phone calls, the rides to appointments, the late-night texts, where I was the one holding the pieces together. I was the invisible thread holding the family fabric from unraveling, the uncredited architect of stability beneath their fragile facade. And for what? A cruel label and a cold shoulder. That contrast burned fiercely inside me. I pulled out a ledger I'd kept meticulously during those years. Not a formal journal, but a log of interactions, financial support, and emotional labor. The entries read like a quiet confession. Transferred $1,200 for mortgage, no acknowledgement, drove dad to oncology appointment, fatigue obvious but no thanks, helped Olivia edit scholarship essay, texted thanks but never mentioned to parents. Each line was a scar, a reminder that my sacrifices had been invisible, or worse, resented. Beyond the financial and caregiving roles, I began to examine my subtle influence on the family business. It was a small enterprise, but one with a legacy spanning decades, and while my name was never on the letterhead, I'd played a key role behind the scenes, offering strategic advice, connecting contacts, smoothing over conflicts. I realized they had relied on my expertise and support more than they admitted, quietly benefiting from my skills while publicly downgrading my value. That realization was both empowering and infuriating. They depended on me, yet they never welcomed me fully. The family's selective blindness was a weapon, and I had been the unwitting target. But now, I saw an opening, a leverage point that could shift the balance of power. Determined to protect myself, I arranged a meeting with my lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Elaine who had worked with Mark and me on our joint finances. I laid out the situation, recounting the family's betrayal and my unwillingness to remain vulnerable to their whims. Elaine listened carefully, nodding as I detailed the extent of my financial support, caregiving efforts, and behind-the-scenes involvement. Together, we began revising my legal documents, updating wills, adjusting power of attorney, and most importantly, securing my business interests. I was careful to separate my assets from the family's entanglements, placing everything under my and Mark's joint ownership where possible. It was a painstaking process, but each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Elaine also advised me on documenting patterns of manipulation and exclusion, suggesting I keep records of interactions that could serve as evidence if disputes arose. I embraced this task with a clinical focus, adding notes to my ledger about dismissive remarks, financial entitlements, and attempts to guilt-trip me. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity and protection. Throughout this phase, I maintained my outward calm. To my family, I remained the same quiet, accommodating Meredith, the familiar figure they could underestimate and ignore. No hints of my plans leaked out. They continued their dismissive behaviors, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my composed exterior. Mark was my steady partner in this. He helped me navigate the legal jargon, listened patiently as I recounted painful memories, and encouraged me not to lose sight of my worth. "You're building an unshakable foundation," he told me one night, as we reviewed the new documents together. "This isn't just about cutting ties. It's about building your future on your own terms. As days turned into weeks, I felt a shift inside me. The painful history still lingered, but it no longer dictated my path. I was no longer the family's secret bank or emotional crutch. I was an autonomous woman taking control. The ledger of past sacrifices became a map for my next moves, a quiet arsenal of truth ready to be wielded. But even as I fortified myself, I knew this was only the beginning. The family's world was about to collide with the reality they'd denied for so long, and I intended to be ready when that day came. The first subtle shift began almost imperceptibly. At first, I just told myself I was making small adjustments, nothing drastic, just a little breathing room for myself. The truth was, I needed space, and I needed control over my own life, free from the endless demands that came with being the family's unpaid caretaker and bank. So I started with the money. Instead of covering the full mortgage payment like I always had, I sent a smaller amount, enough to keep things afloat, but clearly less than before. I watched quietly from a distance, knowing my absence would ripple through their carefully maintained facade. I didn't expect immediate gratitude. There never was any. But I expected that, eventually, the cracks would show. Reducing financial support was a difficult, almost painful act. It felt like withholding a piece of myself that they'd taken for granted for years. But it was necessary. I wasn't breaking a promise to them. No, I was breaking the cycle that kept me tethered to their expectations and dismissals. Mark noticed the tension in my voice whenever I logged onto my banking app, the hesitation before hitting send. You don't have to carry them anymore, he reminded me softly, his hand brushing over mine during late-night conversations. His words were a balm, but this was my battle to fight. Alongside the financial pullback, I began to guard my time more fiercely. Invitations to family dinners, weekend visits, and holiday gatherings came with increasing frequency, as if I was some problem to be coaxed back into the fold or disciplined for my absence. I learned to craft polite but firm refusals. When Susan called to invite me to a Sunday brunch, I replied with a gentle, "I'm sorry, I've got a lot on my plate right now with work and Mark's project. Let's catch up another time." The offer to just come for a little while came next, but I stood my ground. I wasn't being difficult. I was protecting the fragile boundaries I'd built. Calls from Olivia became less frequent but more pointed. Sometimes I let them ring, watching the caller ID blink with her name, my finger hovering hesitantly over the decline button. Other times, I answered but kept my responses brief, steering the conversation away from personal topics. The usual undercurrent of judgment and expectation was always there, lurking beneath her words. "You never come around anymore," she'd say with a tone that tried to sound casual, but felt like an accusation. I'd reply calmly, "I've been busy, Olivia. I'm still here when it matters." She never seemed to hear the message. Passwords on shared accounts and joint family subscriptions became another quiet battlefield. I changed them one evening, making sure the family couldn't access certain financial information or services without my knowledge. It was a small assertion of control, but a necessary one. Mark helped me set up two-factor authentication and secure backups, double-checking that all our assets were safe from unwanted interference. It felt strange and a little sad to build these digital walls around what had once been shared, but trust had been broken long ago. Meanwhile, Olivia and Richard noticed my distance, though they pretended otherwise. At one of their rare phone calls, my father commented with a dismissive chuckle, "Meredith's being difficult again. Probably wants us to beg." I didn't respond. There was no point. Their denial was like a shield they wielded to avoid facing the consequences of their own actions. Behind the scenes, though, I was preparing for something deeper. I wasn't just withdrawing. I was setting traps. Quiet, strategic moves that would reveal the family's dependence on me, whether they acknowledged it or not. When a medical bill was left unpaid, I let a reminder slip through to my mother. When an unexpected expense went uncovered, I watched how they scrambled to find solutions. I was no longer their safety net, and I wanted them to feel that absence without me having to say a word. Mark often marveled at my calm exterior during this time. "You wear your strength well," he said one evening as we shared a cup of chamomile tea. "But don't forget it's okay to stumble." His support was my anchor. Without him, I might have crumbled under the weight of guilt that occasionally threatened to resurface, but I reminded myself, this was not abandonment. It was self-preservation. I also began declining invitations to family events with polite but unequivocal excuses. No more being the amenable sister who showed up just because she was expected to. When Susan asked if I'd join the upcoming holiday dinner, I replied, "I'm taking some time for myself this year. I hope you all have a wonderful evening." The silence that followed on the line was telling. It was the first time in years I'd spoken those words without wavering or apology. The emotional distance grew in parallel with the physical. I stopped answering calls immediately, letting them linger unanswered in voicemail or text. I was no longer at their beck and call. When I did respond, I was deliberate, choosing my words carefully to avoid being drawn into old patterns of guilt or manipulation. It was exhausting to hold this new posture, but necessary. Every interaction was a test of my own resolve. There was a strange freedom in this withdrawal, like finally breathing after being underwater for too long. The family's dismissive behavior continued, but I was no longer internalizing it. I had built a protective wall, a quiet fortress around my life. It was not about punishing them, but about reclaiming my dignity and space. Still, even as I took these steps, I knew this was only the prelude to something bigger. The family might not see it yet, but the foundation was shifting beneath their feet. And when the time came, I would be ready to show them that I was no longer the ugly college dropout they thought they could erase, but a force to be reckoned with on my own terms. The tension between their unaware dismissal and my deliberate distancing was a delicate dance, and I could feel the stakes rising with every passing day. The old dynamics were unraveling, and with each decision to say no, to withhold support, or to protect myself, I edged closer to the moment when everything would have to be confronted. The question was, would they recognize what they'd lost before it was too late? I remember the day of Olivia's graduation with a clarity that felt almost surreal. The city was buzzing with a typical spring energy, the warm breeze threading through the crowded streets, the mingled scent of blooming flowers and freshly brewed coffee drifting from nearby cafes. I had arrived at the university campus unannounced, a quiet shadow among the proud families and eager students. No one expected me. No one had called. And yet, here I was, dressed sharply in a tailored dark blazer and smart trousers, clothes that reflected the professional I had become. I moved through the throng with calm confidence. My heels clicked softly on the polished stone steps as I made my way to the auditorium where the ceremony was being held. Inside, the air was thick with the combined excitement and nerves of a milestone moment, the kind you'd imagine every family would cherish, except for mine. I spotted my family in the crowd almost immediately. Olivia was radiant, the perfect image of success with her cap and gown, her eyes sparkling with pride. My parents sat beside her, their faces beaming as they clapped enthusiastically for the graduates. And there was the professor, a well-respected figure in Olivia's department, engaged in conversation with several faculty members just a few seats away from where the McLeans were gathered. I took a breath and then took my seat nearby, but close enough to be noticed. I wasn't there to blend in or fade away this time. I had spent years building a reputation in marketing, quietly developing campaigns that had launched startups into the spotlight, all without the traditional credentials my family worshipped. I had forged my path with grit, intellect, and an unyielding sense of purpose. Today, I would show them. As the ceremony proceeded, the speeches echoed around the hall. When the moment came for Olivia to be called to the stage, applause erupted. She accepted her diploma with poised grace, and I watched as the professor stepped forward to shake her hand. The man's eyes scanned the audience, and then, unexpectedly, he caught mine. Recognition flickered, subtle yet undeniable. He nodded slightly and leaned over to whisper to someone near him, "Do you know her?" I smiled inwardly and answered silently, "You have no idea." After the ceremony concluded, I approached my family. The room had thinned, and the celebratory buzz shifted into hushed conversations. Richard's eyebrows shot up in surprise as I came into view, his mouth opening slightly without words. Olivia's smile faltered, replaced by a tightness I hadn't seen before. Susan's eyes darted nervously toward the exit, Perhaps wishing I'd never appeared, I didn't wait for their reactions. Instead, I began to speak clearly, calmly, projecting the confidence I had cultivated over years of hardship and quiet determination. I funded much of the family business anonymously for years, I said, watching the shock ripple across their faces. The mortgages, the medical bills, the overhead that kept things afloat, you wouldn't be where you are now without me. Olivia's cheeks flushed, her lips pressing into a thin line. Richard's face shifted from surprise to confusion, unable to reconcile this revelation with the narrative he'd held onto for so long. I looked toward the professor again, who had silently joined the gathering. I also paid for Olivia's education, I continued, voice steady. Not because I wanted credit, but because I believed in our family. Even when you called me Dropout and cut me off, I never stopped supporting you. There was a silence so heavy it felt like the walls themselves absorbed it. The room held its breath. Then, with deliberate clarity, I added, as of today, I have legally removed all of you from my will. Financial support has ceased. This isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries. Respect is non-negotiable. The shock on their faces was unmistakable. The scramble to find words faint and ineffective. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from reclaiming my voice and power in a place where I had once been silenced. One of Olivia's friends, standing nearby, exchanged a puzzled glance with her. The professor stepped forward, his expression respectful, and perhaps a bit impressed. I had no idea, he murmured, as if acknowledging the layers of family dynamics hidden beneath polished smiles. Mark, who had waited discreetly at my side, gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. This was not just my victory, it was ours. The years of unseen sacrifices, the hidden support, and the quiet strength had culminated in this moment. I was no longer the ugly college dropout, relegated to the margins. I was Meredith McLean, a woman who had rewritten her story on her own terms. As I turned away from the stunned crowd, I felt a surge of something powerful, freedom. But I also knew this confrontation was only the beginning. The family's reckoning with reality was inevitable now, and the next chapters would be written in the aftermath of this declaration. For the first time in a long while, I was ready to face whatever came next. The moment I withdrew my support and laid down those boundaries at Olivia's graduation, the shockwave rippled far beyond the stunned faces in that crowded auditorium. I knew the fallout wouldn't be immediate in every sense, but the consequences began to surface almost as soon as I stepped away from that confrontation. Back home, the McLean household quickly felt the strain of my absence. I'd long been the silent financial backbone, the invisible force keeping the family afloat, and now that thread was severed. Unpaid bills started to pile up. I had deliberately let one mortgage payment slip past without my usual intervention, the one Richard and Susan had always assumed would come through without question. Within days, the mortgage company sent a warning letter, and the tension in their voices during frantic calls to each other was unmistakable. I wasn't there to smooth over the cracks anymore. The family business, something I'd quietly propped up by covering shortfalls and advising on strategy, began to falter. When cash flow problems arose and unexpected expenses hit, Richard and Susan scrambled, but it was clear they lacked the knowledge and experience I'd provided behind the scenes. Without my steady hand, decisions became rushed, mistakes crept in, and the once tightly run operation showed signs of unraveling. I heard through mutual contacts that suppliers had questioned payment timelines and employees whispered about management turmoil. The safety net I had woven out of loyalty and responsibility had been pulled away, and the fabric frayed rapidly. Olivia's social standing, built on the foundation of her flawless academic and social record, took a hit as well. Rumors began circulating. Whispers about unpaid tuition fees or last-minute scholarship applications that had suddenly become impossible to secure without my discreet financial backing. Invitations to exclusive events dwindled, and some of her closest friends started pulling away, unsure of how to navigate the sudden instability. The golden child, once untouchable, was now faltering under the weight of expectations and newfound vulnerabilities. I watched from a distance as the carefully maintained image began to crack, and though part of me felt vindicated, I also recognized the hard lessons running through every downfall. Meanwhile, Richard and Susan swung into a panic I hadn't seen before. The authoritative patriarch who once dismissed me as difficult, or a lost cause, was now leaving frantic voicemails and sending desperate texts. "Meredith, we need to talk. Please. We're sorry. We didn't realize how much we depended on you." Susan's messages were longer, filled with guilt and pleading tones. She tried to paint a picture of wanting to make things right, of bridging the gap, but beneath the words was an unmistakable undertone of entitlement, the expectation that I would return to my old role, forgiving and forgetting without conditions. I read those messages late at night, my phone glowing in the dark room. Mark sat beside me, his hand steady on mine. "You don't owe them anything," he reminded me softly, and he was right. I felt the old pull, years of conditioning urging me to take the calls, to soothe the family's panic, to be the peacemaker once more. But this time, I recognized it for what it was, a demand, not a request. So I chose silence. I didn't respond. Not yet. Olivia's reaction was more volatile. Stripped of the financial safety net I'd provided and faced with the collapse of her social standing, she lashed out with a fury I hadn't seen before. Phone calls turned into confrontations, with her voice sharp and accusing. "You think you're better than us now? You're nothing without us, Meredith." Her words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they revealed the resentment simmering beneath years of competition and pain. I answered calmly, setting firm boundaries, refusing to be drawn into a cycle of blame and recrimination. But her anger was relentless, a storm I could no longer weather. Outside the family circle, the McLean's public image began to suffer. Friends, neighbors, and business acquaintances started to notice the cracks, whispers of conflict, financial instability, and fractured relationships. Invitations to social gatherings stopped coming. The pristine facade of a perfect family was tarnished, and I was the catalyst. I didn't seek this, but I accepted it as part of the reckoning that had to happen. Through all this upheaval, I remained unshaken. My resolve, forged in years of quiet resilience, held firm. I knew that boundaries without consequences were meaningless, and this fallout was the price of demanding respect and honesty. Mark's unwavering support kept me grounded, reminding me that my value was not tied to their approval or their chaos. Each day, as I watched the family grapple with the consequences of their choices, unpaid bills stacking up, a struggling business, strained relationships, I felt a mixture of sorrow and vindication. It wasn't joy or revenge, it was justice, a long overdue balancing act. But this was only the beginning. The true test lay ahead. Whether they would confront the realities I'd exposed and seek genuine change, or retreat into denial and further fracture what little remained of our family ties. And I was ready to face whatever came next, standing firm in the quiet power of my newfound independence. The fallout from my withdrawal of support wasn't just immediate. It deepened and broadened in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. It felt like watching a carefully constructed house begin to crack from the foundation, each fissure a consequence of years of unspoken dependencies suddenly exposed. Financial pressures tightened like a vice on my family, forcing them into uncomfortable decisions and lifestyle changes they were wholly unprepared for. Almost overnight, the McLean household began to feel the strain, the luxurious trappings of their carefully curated life, the elegant dinners, the weekend getaways, the new cars, started to fade into the background as unpaid bills stacked up on the kitchen counter, ignored until the mounting letters and phone calls became impossible to overlook. The mortgage payment, which I had once covered quietly, was now late, prompting calls from the bank that stirred panic through the house. The familiar sense of security that had been propped up by my silent sacrifices was gone. I heard through the grapevine that Richard and Susan had to confront the harsh reality. Their finances were not as robust as they claimed. For the family business, the consequences were even more tangible. The small enterprise, once steady under the veneer of success, began to creak under pressure. I'd been the shadow strategist, the one who smoothed over supplier disputes, advised on the budgeting, and quietly filled financial gaps when revenue fell short. Now, without that safety net, mistakes started to multiply. Payment delays unsettled their suppliers, and word spread among the employees that management was in disarray. The carefully maintained image of a thriving family business was fraying, with no clear leader stepping up to fill the void I left. Watching this unravel from a distance brought a complex swirl of emotions: sadness, vindication, and a grudging understanding that my absence was making visible what had been hidden for so long. Meanwhile, Olivia, once the untouchable golden child, found herself facing a harsh new reality. She had always thrived on the illusion of perfection. The straight A's, the prestigious internships, the endless stream of accolades that painted her life as enviable. But beneath the surface, Olivia's world was built on precarious support, much of it quietly sustained by me. Without the financial backing she had never acknowledged, rumors began to flicker among her social circles. Whispers about last-minute scholarship appeals, unpaid fees, and the sudden lack of sponsorship at events spread like wildfire. Invitations to high-profile gatherings dwindled, and some of her closest friends began to pull away, unsure how to navigate the instability that had suddenly entered Olivia's life. The confident, polished facade she wore so carefully was cracking, revealing the vulnerability she had worked so hard to conceal. The emotional toll on Olivia was palpable even from afar. Anxiety crept into her voice when Mark and I occasionally spoke to her, a quiver beneath her usual assertiveness. I could almost hear the tremor of uncertainty she tried to mask behind bravado. The burden of sustaining her image without the safety net she had silently counted on weighed heavily. Her attacks on me, once sharp and accusatory, began to falter under the weight of reality. I understood then that my boundaries were forcing her to confront not just financial hardship, but also the emotional fractures she had long denied. My parents, Richard and Susan, were thrust into a frantic state I had rarely seen. The patriarch who once dismissed me with a wave of his hand was now leaving anxious voicemails and sending desperate texts, his tone shifting from authoritarian to pleading. "Meredith, please, let's talk. We didn't realize how much we depended on you. We're sorry. We want to make this right." Susan's messages were longer, filled with guilt and tentative offers of reconciliation, but beneath her words was an unmistakable undercurrent of entitlement, the expectation that I would simply return to my old role, to forgive and forget without demands. I read these messages late at night, the glow of my phone casting shadows across the room as Mark sat beside me, his hand steady and reassuring. "You don't owe them anything," he reminded me softly. And he was right. Part of me still felt that deep-seated urge to answer, to be the peacemaker, the one who always smoothed the family's rough edges. But now, I recognized it for what it was, a demand dressed as an apology. So I chose silence. Olivia's reaction was the most volatile and, in some ways, the most heartbreaking. Stripped suddenly of the financial and emotional safety net I had quietly provided, she lashed out in anger and denial. Phone calls from her turned into confrontations filled with accusation and bitterness. "You think you're better than us now? You're nothing without us, Meredith." Her words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they revealed the resentment and pain simmering beneath years of rivalry and misunderstanding. I responded calmly, setting firm boundaries, refusing to be drawn into her storm. But her fury was relentless, a tempest I could no longer endure. Outside the immediate family, the ripples extended even further. Friends, neighbors, and business acquaintances began to sense the tension behind the closed doors of the McLean household. Whispers about financial troubles and fractured relationships spread quietly at social gatherings and community events. Invitations to exclusive circles ceased, and the family's polished reputation started to tarnish. The perfect image of the McLeans was dissolving, and I was the catalyst. I had not sought this outcome, but I understood it as part of the reckoning that had to come. Through all the upheaval, my resolve remained firm. I had learned that boundaries without consequences were meaningless, and this fallout was the cost of demanding respect and honesty. Mark's unwavering support was my anchor, reminding me that my worth was not tied to their approval or their chaos. Each day, as I witnessed the family struggle with the consequences of their choices, unpaid bills stacking up, a faltering business, strained and fractured relationships, I felt a mixture of sorrow and quiet vindication. It was not a feeling of triumph or revenge, but a long overdue justice settling into place, a reckoning they had avoided for far too long. Yet, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Whether the McLeans would confront the realities I'd exposed and seek genuine change, or retreat further into denial, remained to be seen. And I found myself ready to face whatever came next, standing firm in the quiet strength of my newfound independence. The hardest lesson I had to learn, and the most freeing, was that sometimes family means letting go. Not because I stopped caring, but because love without respect is a poison that slowly erodes your soul. After everything, I realized that the ties that bind us aren't meant to strangle us, and that holding on to hope for change in others can trap you in a cycle of pain and disappointment. So, I made a decision. Not just a reaction to betrayal, but a deliberate, unshakable boundary. Family contact would only be possible if it came with respect, honesty, and equality. If those conditions weren't met, then permanent distance was my choice, and my protection. Setting those boundaries was terrifying at first. It felt like tearing down the walls of the only home I'd ever known, brick by brick. But it was also a moment of reclaiming my dignity, a reclaiming of my story. I stopped answering calls that ended in criticism or silent treatment. I declined invitations that came with strings attached or veiled judgments. When Olivia or my parents reached out with guilt-laden pleas or demands disguised as concern, I responded with silence or calm clarity. No more explanations. No more justifications. I carried the weight of years of sacrifice, and now I was carrying myself, with no apologies. There were moments when the absence of family stung like a fresh wound. Birthdays passed without a word. Holidays came and went without my name spoken. Photos of gatherings appeared on social media. Smiles and laughter frozen in images that didn't include me. It was a strange kind of grief, one that didn't have a neat ending or a comforting resolution. But in that grief, I found strength. I learned to nurture myself in ways they never did, through friendships that honored me, through Mark's unwavering belief in my worth, and through the quiet achievements that no one else got to define. I built a new kind of family around me, not made of blood alone, but of mutual support, respect, and shared dreams. My closest friends became my chosen sisters and brothers. With Mark, I built a home infused with kindness and understanding, a sanctuary from the judgment I'd known. We celebrated each other's wins, no matter how small, without comparison or competition. For the first time, I felt what it meant to be truly seen, and it was life-changing. The McLean family's reaction, or lack thereof, taught me a painful truth about control. I couldn't force them to see me or respect me, no matter how loudly I spoke or how much I proved, but I could control how I allowed their actions to affect me. I could choose distance over toxicity, peace over pain. I refused to be defined by their narrative any longer. I remember the day I told Olivia, during a rare and tense phone call, "If you want a relationship with me, it has to be built on respect and honesty. Otherwise, I'm done." Her silence at the other end was deafening. It was clear that our sisterhood, once a bond I'd cherished, was now a fragile, conditional thing. But that was her choice, not mine. Over time, the family's dysfunction remained, but I no longer carried the burden of fixing it. I watched from afar as strained apologies came and went, as patterns repeated themselves, but I stayed firm. The quiet strength I'd cultivated wasn't just about standing alone, it was about standing true to myself. In the end, I redefined what family first meant for me. It wasn't a slogan for blind loyalty or enduring abuse. It was about choosing the people who choose you back, who lift you up instead of tearing you down. It was about honoring myself enough to say no, to walk away, and to build something better. For the first time in years, I felt a peace that wasn't dependent on their approval. It was born from my own self-respect and the love I cultivated within. This new chapter wasn't about erasing the past, but about writing a future where I was no longer the ugly college dropout or the forgotten daughter. I was Meredith McLean, a woman who learned that sometimes the most courageous act of love is protecting your heart by choosing who deserves to hold it. And with that choice, I found freedom.